Opportunity Speaker Series. This is a new public lecture series launched by the FedEx Institute of Technology. It focuses on the social, political, legal, ethical, and philosophical aspects of technology with the aim of broadening our understanding of technology's impacts. National and international scholars from the humanities, fine arts and communication, and the social sciences will be joining us this year. You can find out more about this series at the FedEx Institute of Technology website. Check the chat for a link. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Kathleen Thelen as the first speaker of our new series. Dr. Thelen is a political economist and endowed professor at MIT, and the former president of the flagship Political Science Association in the US, the APSA. She has won a number of research awards, including the Aaron Wildofsky Enduring Contribution Prize in 2019, the Michael Andres Research Prize in 2019, and the Barrington Moore Book Prize in 2015. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2015, and to the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Sciences in 2009. Her research focuses on the origins and evolution of political economic institutions in rich democracies. She is the author of several books, including Varieties of Liberalization and the New Politics of Social Solidarity in 2014, and How Institutions Evolve in 2004. And she's co-editor of Advances in Comparative Historical Analysis with James Mahoney in 2015, and Beyond Continuity with Wolfgang Streeck in 2005. Her recent work is directly on changes in the political economy resulting from new technologies, especially the platform economy, the rise of IP, changes in labor, and changes in labor. Her work has important and direct implications for anyone thinking about what these changes mean for rich democracies. Her talk today is entitled Platform Power. Welcome, Dr. Thelen.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much for inviting me, especially to be the inaugural speaker in this wonderful series. It sounds wonderful, and thanks also for that very nice introduction. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. That set up. Can you see that? Okay. Okay, so my talk has this very broad title, Platform Power. And the reason that it's kind of so broad is that I'm actually going to be drawing on a few different strands of work that I've been engaged in over the past few years. So each of the, so there are going to be several different arguments woven in here, and each of them is developed in somewhat more detail in a couple of different papers that I'm happy to share with anybody that's interested in sort of diving a little deeper into any aspect of it. The truth is that I couldn't decide which of three papers to present, so I'm kind of doing a mashup of all three. But the talk itself is divided into two main parts. And the first part is going to be drawing on work that I co-authored with a colleague, a legal scholar actually, Sabeel Rahman. And this is work that has to do with the kind of distinctive political economic institutions in the United States that have really facilitated the rise of these powerful platform firms. And here the question is going to be like, what is it about the United States that seems to have provided such a congenial environment for these kinds of firms to kind of grow and thrive? What's different about the American political economy that has allowed these kinds of firms to really flourish? And then the second part of the talk is going to be drawing on co-authored work that I did with another colleague, Pepper Culpepper, who's a political scientist at Oxford University, in which we're trying to sort of highlight the role of consumers as a really key part of the coalition on which the political power of these platform firms rests. Because, at least in the United States, or especially in the United States, consumers, we argue, are just a huge part of the story of why these firms have been so successful, not just successful economically, but successful politically as well. Obviously, consumers are important in everywhere in all countries, but we're going to argue that the role of consumers kind of figures especially prominently in the United States. And then kind of throughout the talk, I'm going to be also kind of weaving in some of the results of a comparative study that I did a few years ago on one particular platform firm, namely Uber, which was kind of a great natural experiment because Uber's arrival, was this kind of disruptive event that it hit a whole bunch of countries at more or less the same time, right? And so if you're a comparative political economist like me, that's wonderful. That's like a natural experiment. It just doesn't get any better than that. Basically, what it allowed me to do is to observe how different countries responded to this kind of shared shock in quite different ways. And the countries that I look at are rich democracies, in particular Europe, and comparing that to the United States. Okay, so to begin, what are we talking about here? So all of these papers are concerned with the distinctive features of these new vanguard firms of the 20th century, Uber, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Grubhub, and all the rest. And all of these firms have been sort of pioneers of this new type of business model that certainly builds on some developments that had already begun to take shape in the 1980s and 1990s, but really combined them with new features in order to kind of create and capture value in new ways. So different authors define the boundaries of what constitutes a platform firm in a whole bunch of different ways. And I don't want to get into the details of various definitions, because there are just a couple of core features on which everybody seems to basically agree. And the first of these is the centrality of data. The kind of power that these firms wield rests above all on their capacity to extract and harness really immense amounts of data. That's really what's at the center of their business model. And that's, of course, also what's at the core of their power as well. So the centrality of data is a first feature that everybody kind of agrees on. The second core feature has to do with issues of ownership versus control. So if you read the popular press these days and how these firms are being written about, you see a lot of analogies comparing them to sort of monopolies of the of the past, like the monopolies, U.S. Steel and Standard Oil, these monopolies from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But what's really different about today's platform firms is that the goal is not so much direct ownership as it is control, right? These firms tend not to own that much in the way of kind of physical infrastructure. They don't employ, that many people. Amazon is obviously a big exception to that, but by and large, a lot of these companies don't employ that many people. The real source of dominance is that they're acting as kind of crucial intermediaries, right? And intermediaries that control market interactions in both directions, between workers and employers. If it's Uber and Lyft, it's between drivers and riders, between buyers and sellers. If it's YouTube, then it's between content creators and viewers. And of course, pretty centrally for platforms like Google and Facebook, between advertisers and consumers. And then finally, the distinctive feature of many of these platforms has to do with the role of consumers, who figure really centrally, I think, not just in the market strategies that these firms are pursuing, but in their political strategies as well. And as I said, that's really especially true in the United States, where the kind of concentrated power that these firms, that these platforms often command is often rationalized, it's often defended kind of under the banner of serving consumer interests. So let me then turn to this first question, why the United States? And again, this is going to draw on this work, this joint work with Sabil Rahman, which is exploring some of the distinctive political and institutional conditions that have really fostered and promoted this new business model in the United States. So obviously, US firms have been the big pioneers in this space. And so Sabil and I were basically interested in, why the US wound up playing this vanguard role. So that's something that is often kind of attributed to, America's entrepreneurial culture or, American ingenuity. And as you can sort of pick up from my tone, we're a little skeptical of that. One thing is certainly true, and that is that American platform firms benefited enormously from a significant technological lead that resulted not so much from ingenuity or whatever, but really from a whole lot of previous defense spending on research and development, and that really, of course, produced some of the kind of core technologies on which these platforms then get built. But we think that's not the whole of the story, because these technologies also, of course, had to be adapted. They had to be deployed in markets. They had to be deployed in consumer markets specifically. So we try to draw attention to the political, economic, and institutional features of the American political economy that we think provided a kind of unusually congenial context for these firms to grow and thrive. And so we emphasize three such features, and I'm going to go through these one at a time. The first is basically an extremely permissive regulatory landscape. So it turns out that compared to other rich democracies, the regulatory landscape in the United States is just unusually fragmented. It's marked by a whole lot more decentralization. You have a whole lot more sort of overlapping and sometimes competing regulatory jurisdictions. Basically, to simplify really greatly, in most European countries, regulatory powers are much more centralized. You don't have all these different levels of government. Most European countries, not all, but most are unitary rather than federal systems. Cities, by and large, do not have the same extensive powers that they do in the United States. The judiciary in most European countries is, first of all, less politicized, but it's also a whole lot less involved in regulatory issues. That's all more delegated to pretty strong and centralized bureaucracies that are charged with, sort of enforcing national rules. And all of that is pretty different from the United States, where you have these different levels of government, federal level, state level, city level, and often with kind of overlapping powers in some areas. You also have, the bureaucracy, of course, involved in and agencies involved in these kinds of regulatory issues. So is Congress, the judiciary, the courts are also pretty involved in a lot of economic regulation in a way that's just different from other countries. We even have, of course, competing agencies at the federal level. One kind of prominent example that's relevant in the context of platform firms is we have two different entities, the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, that kind of share responsibility for antitrust enforcement, but the boundaries between the two are kind of fuzzy. And the division of labor between the two is pretty fuzzy. And historically, actually, the FTC and the DOJ were not particularly on the same page with respect to antitrust. That was especially the case in the 1920s. They're more eye to eye now, but nonetheless, you have this kind of division of authority. Anyway, this fragmented regulatory landscape, we argue, really gives these firms a kind of huge advantage. Because it basically hinders the development of a coherent, timely government response as these firms were emerging. In general, a kind of central challenge that these firms pose is that many of the strategies that they're pursuing are simply not well covered by the existing regulatory apparatus. they're operating under rules that were mostly inherited from a very different sort of industrial era. So many of these firms, of course, took advantage of this kind of growing precisely by moving rather aggressively into legal gray zones, kind of pushing the bounds of existing regulatory rules, kind of creating whole new markets beyond the reach of existing policies and existing frameworks. And sometimes these firms have been quite explicit about this. The famous example is, Facebook's motto of moving fast and breaking things. But more generally, the whole Silicon Valley kind of mantra has been don't ask permission, ask forgiveness. So the success of these firms, we think, is not just a matter of sort of technological prowess. It's also really involved pretty heavy doses of regulatory entrepreneurship, even regulatory arbitrage as well. That's actually a big part in many cases of the business plan. So, the United States is not uniquely open or vulnerable to such strategies, but we think that this fragmented regulatory infrastructure kind of made it unusually vulnerable to them. This is a context that kind of rewards arbitrage because it allows these firms to grow to scale, to consolidate a market, to gain lots of consumer support, basically before government regulators are able to sort of catch up. You see a little bit or a lot, maybe even, of this dynamic these days with Bitcoin, which is, this new financial frontier, and where the regulators are kind of chasing along behind the developments. So basically, this is a context. The American political economy is a context that kind of really a lot sort of benefits these kinds of firms. So, for example, Amazon really grew up in a kind of legal void before government officials had figured out how to regulate internet commerce. And actually, a whole lot of the price advantage that Amazon enjoyed for many years had to do with the way that it took advantage of the different state jurisdictions in order to, American federalism, basically, to avoid having to charge sales taxes on the goods it was selling in many states, which went on for a whole, until they had really built up a pretty big market share. Uber is also a pretty prominent case of this kind of regulatory arbitrage, maybe even a more extreme case of it, because in that case, of course, the company often moved into a city and basically ignored local regulations completely, and then basically waited to see whether city officials were going to challenge them. And in many cases, actually, as I was watching this unfold, in city after city, in many cases the cities didn't really challenge them. In fact, a lot of times the company was able to kind of play on competition among different municipalities, and you had cities kind of jockeying for to kind of portray themselves as very open to technology, to innovation, and this all gave Uber obviously quite a lot of leverage. And then in some cases, for example, when the company didn't get the rules that it wanted at the local level, it could appeal to a higher level. So for an example of that is in Austin, Texas, where Austin basically was trying to impose somewhat stricter sort of safety regulations on Uber, having to do with fingerprinting. And basically Uber really lobbied at the state level, and indeed the state level, the governor preempted the city from imposing these stricter laws. And then, of course, if all of that fails, then the companies can take things to court and get things all kind of held up in long, drawn out court cases as well. So this is the kind of fragmentation of public authority that you just don't see to the same extent in other rich democracies, where you have these much stronger sort of central state bureaucracies. And so we think that that's a first characteristic of the political economic landscape in the United States. It's really provided a pretty congenial environment for these things to grow to scale. A second factor is an extremely supportive legal regime. So starting in the 1970s, but especially since the 1980s, the United States really embraced consumer welfare as the kind of primary metric on which American antitrust enforcement depends, and where consumer welfare, this whole consumer welfare standard that is getting applied, has been pretty narrowly focused on issues of price. And so this is the kind of culmination or the result of the rise to dominance of the so-called Chicago School of Law and Economics, which basically sort of applies an economic efficiency logic to a bunch of legal questions without a tremendous regard for political or social issues. And this is something that has had a really enormous impact on antitrust theory and practice in the United States. So, given that Google really does deliver superior search results, basically for free or ostensibly for free, given that Amazon can provide consumers with more or less anything they want at low prices and a whole lot faster than most of their competitors, the pro-consumer orientation of American antitrust has really been a second factor, providing a singularly fertile terrain in which these platform firms have been able to thrive. By contrast, European competition authorities are, they're certainly keyed into consumer welfare issues, but they have a somewhat different way of thinking about that, which is placing a whole lot more weight on preserving competition per se, preserving competition in the market as an important aspect of protecting consumer welfare, which is why you see more cases being brought and won actually in the European Union by the EU Competition Authority. This is Marguerite Vestager, who is at the head of that, and she's been much more aggressive in prosecuting these firms for what's called abuse of a dominant position. So the character of the legal regime in the United States is another feature of the American political economy that we think really played a pretty important role in the ability of these firms to grow and to thrive. And then a final factor is financing. So the American political economy is heavily financialized. The financial sector is big and important. And this has been really important in providing the really abundant sums of patient capital that these platform firms often require to grow to scale. Okay, so these are all winner-take-all markets or winner-take-most markets, right? And so achieving dominance in these markets has often meant for these firms basically the ability to kind of take losses, absorb losses year after year in order to build to scale and in order to kind of vanquish rivals within the market. You saw this in Uber and Amazon and a whole bunch of these platforms. They were just taking losses year after year. Rising to dominance also can mean anticipating and absorbing potential rivals, small companies that could grow into rivals. And of course, we have the famous examples of Facebook acquiring WhatsApp and Instagram. So all of these kinds of strategies that these companies need to pursue as they grow require just vast sums of money. And above all, they need investors who are willing to adopt a really long time horizon and not demand sort of quarterly, sort of profits or anything. And often, frankly, they require investors that are also willing to kind of absorb the legal costs, this very significant legal costs that are often associated with these strategies of regulatory arbitrage and kind of boundary pushing that I was talking about a minute ago as these firms are scaling up. So one very important source of funding, of course, for these kinds of firms that are risky, but that have, sort of high potential, is venture capital. And of course, the US for decades has had really very vibrant venture capital market. But that's actually not unique to the United States. Sweden, which is a very different type of economy, also has a really vibrant, big, robust venture capital market as well. What's more distinctive about the US is that it has also produced a whole lot more so-called angel investors. These are basically the super rich who are often willing to provide financing to these kinds of operations. And they're also able and willing to exercise more patience with their investments than even the typical venture capital firm. And so part of this is a kind of side effect of really extreme inequalities in wealth. In the United States, you just have a whole lot of money kind of sloshing around among the super rich in the United States without a whole lot of outlets for productive investment. And that's something, there's just much less of that in Europe, for example, because high-end inequality, sort of the top 1%, the super rich are certainly becoming richer in Europe, but the level of inequality is just quite a bit lower. It's a really much more compressed income ladder. So these angel investors are a really valuable source of capital because they're the ones who are willing to sort of absorb these losses in the short run in pursuit of later winner-take-all returns. So all of these factors come together in the U.S. To support these new business models that are premised on a kind of what we think of as a kind of alliance between consumers on the one hand who appreciate these companies and these investors who invest in their success. And this is an alliance that has proved especially successful in the American context. So this then segues over to the work, the second part of the talk, and the work that I did with Pepper, called Pepper, that is really very centrally concerned with the role of consumers as a key part of this political alliance and the support system, basically, on which many of these platforms rest. So this alliance with consumers is really, I think, what distinguishes today's platform firms from all of these other kinds of monopolies in the past. It's a crucial source of durability, sort of appealing to sort of the rhetoric of defending consumer interests, helps legitimize the entire business model. So this whole rhetoric often plays a really central role in the arguments that these firms advance whenever they're faced with pressure from regulators. So this is all just really different from monopolies of yesteryear, right? So we all, a lot of people depended on U.S. Steel, but nobody loved U.S. Steel. Nobody likes the electricity company that, even though we all depend on it. But people do love Amazon, and the relationship between these platforms and their users goes way beyond simple like loyalty. Nike appeals to consumers on the basis of brand, and some people are very loyal to Nike. But platform firms like Facebook, Google, any of these, they just enjoy a much more direct and unmediated link to their users, who literally are connecting to these firms with through devices that they're carrying in their pockets every day. So these platforms are just, in a way that's just not true of, say, Nike or any other brand that you may love. They're just completely integrated into the fabric of our lives. So these firms, of course, understand this, and they have been really adept at weaponizing their consumer base, kind of leveraging users into a really crucial form of political support. Right, and then wielding them as a kind of shield against unwelcome regulation. And so Uber is kind of the poster child for these kinds of strategies. In the past, whenever they were kind of threatened with regulation in a particular city, they would install a tab, you see one on the screen here, that would allow the user to like send a message to their political representative to sort of register their opposition to that whatever regulation was being considered. And so here you see that what you can do is you can literally tap on that tab, and a message will go from you to your representative. So for political scientists, this is really a new kind of corporate power. We, in the past, political scientists at least, have thought of corporations as exercising power either by kind of lobbying politicians, or through these kind of quiet backroom deals in smoke-filled rooms, or sometimes we've thought of politicians kind of exercising forbearance toward big important companies because they may be afraid that if they regulate them too heavily, they will move to some other location and they'll take their jobs, they'll take their investments with them. And it's of course not like these firms don't possess and exercise those kinds of those more familiar forms of power. These companies do have tremendous financial resources. They of course have active lobbies in Washington, D.C., in Brussels, really in political capitals around the world. But it's not clear that that's the central or primary source of their political power. And so the claim that we make is that at least a part of their power derives from the rather unique position that they hold in the lives of consumers. So politicians may not be so much worried about the kind of economic consequences if they cross these firms, but they do worry about the potential political fallout. Right. So in the United States, just there are very few politicians who are really interested in kind of denying their constituents the convenience of having Amazon deliver basically whatever they want in 2 days flat. So while political scientists in the past have typically thought about all the ways in which business power is exercised kind of against the public. That's how we thought about Standard Oil. That's how we thought about U.S. Steel, et cetera. It was all kind of these companies operating against the public interest. But that's really not so true, or it's not true in the same way for these firms. To the extent that Google does deliver these superior search results faster and better than competitors, than the alternatives, to the extent that Amazon makes shopping easier, less expensive, whatever, these firms exercise the kind of power that these firms are wielding is mostly exercised in a pretty close alliance with a public that enjoys the fruits of innovation, and that in many ways has come to depend on these firms. And this is just all, if anything, been enhanced in the context of the pandemic when everything went online. I was just checking, and Amazon now accounts for fully 50% of the e-commerce market, and the e-commerce market is growing a lot faster than the Main Street commerce market. And so this is just a source of power that's only grown during the pandemic. So even though, in principle or in theory, people don't like, or they may hear and don't like, that Amazon workers are working under these pretty extreme working conditions, they may sort of not feel good about that, but it doesn't seem to really register very strongly in the behavior of most American consumers. So in short, these firms are often succeeding in getting what they want, kind of because the public wants it too. Now, these firms, of course, don't always get their way. And so one of the things that we do in the paper is also try to explore the conditions under which this kind of consumer platform alliance can be disrupted. And we think that there are broadly two types of situation. One has to do with the venue in which these firms are getting regulated. So as I just said, we usually think of these companies as kind of shying away from big public battles. They prefer, we usually think they prefer kind of quiet backroom deals. But it turns out that platform firms often really seek out big public fights. And they seek them out. Why? Because they think they can win them. And so the best example of this, I think, is, or the best recent example is Proposition 22, which was this referendum in California that overturned a new law that the legislature had just passed that would have made Uber and Lyft pay their drivers benefits or provide their drivers with benefits. And Uber and Lyft ran a huge and hugely expensive public relations campaign. And as you see from the results on the right of the screen, they voters resoundingly backed them. They got almost 60% of the vote. So if platform firms benefit from big public battles, one strategy to get more sort of regulatory leverage on them can be to change the venue. The courts, for example, can be expected to be somewhat more shielded from public opinion. And indeed, if you look at the record of the platforms, how they do in the courts, it's a much more mixed record. They certainly don't always prevail. And that's actually more what we see in other countries, is much more sort of closed regulatory sort of deliberations. So when Uber launched in Germany, for example, the issue was not played out in a public referendum, nor frankly was it left to individual cities to decide, because the cities could be, of course, played off against one another. Instead, the conflict was really immediately nationalized to make sure that there would be one sort of uniform set of rules to avoid this kind of jurisdictional competition. And then the decision was taken in pretty closed and sort of not very sort of not in the public sphere, basically in more closed administrative procedures. And that way of going about things then robbed the company of the opportunity to build up a big loyal consumer base, and then you sort of go on to set the terms of the debate by establishing themselves as champions of efficiency, innovation, consumer choice, whatever. Instead, the whole issue in Germany was dealt with as an enforcement issue, basically, and it was framed much more in terms of a kind of defense of the rule of law, and where the government stepped in to basically enforce existing regulations to ensure a level playing field by basically requiring Uber to play by the existing rules rather than to renegotiate the rules to accommodate Uber. And because Uber had not been able to build up a big loyal consumer base, this framing of the question also really, in an interesting way, took hold in the public discourse as well. I did a whole newspaper analysis of Uber's arrival in a bunch of different countries, and that was really a striking difference. And here you just see one cartoon from the time, where, as you see, Uber is basically being sort of depicted as a kind of danger, as a wolf in sheep's clothing. So this then leads to the second way in which this consumer platform alliance can be disrupted. And that has to do with how issues are framed. And in particular, if issues come to be framed in ways that mobilize people as citizens rather than as consumers. And sometimes this is actually an explicit political strategy. So my favorite example of that is a campaign that was sort of done against Uber in Denmark a few years ago. And it was actually a campaign that was spearheaded by the unions. And they used this popular Danish comedian, the guy that you see on the screen, in a series of ads, basically to draw attention to the fact that Uber's business model was resting pretty heavily on tax avoidance, basically. It was tax avoidance on the part of the drivers partly, but it was also that Uber was kind of taking their own profits or parking their own profits in not in Denmark, but in the headquarters in the Netherlands, where they benefit from lower corporate tax rate. So basically, what the union was doing in this ad campaign, which was extremely effective, was appealing to the public not as consumers, but as taxpayers and as citizens, and above all, as beneficiaries of Denmark's rather generous and universalistic welfare regime. So the point of the ads was basically to say that this kind of behavior, this kind of sort of getting around the rules type of behavior, this kind of legal gray zone, this kind of regulatory arbitrage, if you will, was not consistent with the Danish model of social solidarity. Uber's strategies, they argued, were just undermining the state's ability to pay for all of these extensive welfare services that Danish citizens enjoy. And so basically the idea was, and what they succeeded in doing, was shifting the debate away from the kind of convenience and the low cost of Uber, and instead kind of cast Uber as being at odds with the preservation of a national system that only works if everybody kind of pays their fair share. So those are sort of foreign examples, but there are also some examples of this that are closer to home. So data protection seems to be one issue, kind of a wedge issue, that can also disrupt this kind of platform consumer alliance. This, of course, became a big deal in the Cambridge Analytica scandal of a few years ago, when it came out that personal data from belonging to millions of Facebook users was getting collected without their consent by this British consulting firm, Cambridge Analytica, and then used for political advertising. So this is an example, and people got sort of exercised about this. And so this was one example where consumers did kind of rise up and sort of turn on the platform and sort of mobilize against it. Another example of an issue that seems to mobilize people as citizens, again, as opposed to kind of consumers, is that's more recent even, is the use of social media platforms like Facebook by these kind of unsavory or sort of right-wing groups. And one saw this especially now in the sort of hue and cry after that Facebook do something after in the wake of the January 6th insurrection. So privacy issues, these kinds of data issues, they can disrupt this consumer platform alliance, because they tend to alert people to the fact that the services that they're getting are not necessarily free, that they may have some kind of downsides with respect to privacy, or with respect to sort of the use of these resources by people they don't agree with. And those moments, those kinds of issues become a source of vulnerability for these firms, because it makes them harder, makes it harder for them to portray themselves as simply operating always and only in the interests of consumers. It kind of makes them cast them in the role of the bad guys. And that then can often provide a kind of opening for regulators to sort of step in and have more leeway. So quickly, by way of conclusion, these firms, are very powerful, but they are not, invincible. One lesson from the rich democracies, I think, is that if you're going to try to regulate these companies, you need to move pretty fast because they are moving really fast. And, because once these firms really have developed this kind of large, loyal consumer base, it's really harder for politicians to kind of deny their constituents access to popular new services. They develop a kind of built-in bias against regulation, or at least against any kind of regulation that could, increase the costs of the service, or, make it less convenient for consumers. Now, as I was just saying, it's also the case that sometimes you can mobilize consumers to favor regulation. Sometimes consumers do get kind of mad. Sometimes they do demand regulation. But if you kind of look at this stuff over a long period of time, it does also seem to be the case that consumers tend to have pretty short memories. Like, Cambridge Analytica, I don't know about you, but it really does sort of seem a little bit like ancient history. Consumers also have pretty short attention spans. And so when it comes to kind of durable countervailing forces to constrain or regulate these companies, at the end of the day, I think that consumers are not likely to be the ones to play the kind of starring role. I think it's much more likely that the courts or competition authorities, like in the case of the US, it would be the FTC, are really the ones who are going to play the more important part in imposing limits on these companies. So thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Dr. Thelen. That was great. We can take questions now in the Q&A. If you want to use the Q&A button down in the right-hand corner.
You're also welcome to use the chat box as well if you feel more comfortable using that.
Well, I can start. I don't see any yet, but I can start. I was curious if there are any indication that sort of climate change, sort of environmental ways of framing the issues have any take on, breaking that coalition between consumers and companies.
I'm trying to think what kinds of companies. I mean, the wedge issues would of course be different depending on what the precise nature of the company. Do you have a particular type of platform in mind for how climate could figure in there? I mean, I know that.
I mean, in my own case, Amazon, it comes in 2 days. I mean, and the amount that it's shipping, for instance, and all of the impact, the environmental impact of all that shipping. I wonder whether framing it in terms of environmental costs for citizens would have a way of breaking that. I mean, probably not in Amazon's case, but I'm wondering if there's other cases where the environmental issues have allowed consumers to think more as citizens rather than as consumers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I suppose that would be a conversation that would have different sides to it. And I can imagine that sort of like transportation platforms would say, well, you could make an environmental argument against the transportation companies to the extent that they compete with, say, public transportation, which is
Right.
more efficient and much more sort of friendly toward the environment. And so those might be the kinds of things that, of course, presupposes that you do have a public transportation system.
Right.
And so one of the issues in the United States is that to the extent that some of these platforms sort of serve as substitutes for missing public infrastructure, on the one hand, that can be a kind of relief in the short run, because if you don't have public infrastructure, it becomes a substitute for that. But of course, what it simultaneously does is box out the kind of collective action that you would need in order to create the public version of this
Right.
this thing.
Good. Okay, we do have a question. Why was Amazon unable to prevent taxation of its transactions?
So I'm trying to remember what how that was resolved, but I think that it was would like to answer this question live. I think that it was a court case, and I think that basically what happened was that so for many years it was the case that different states had different tax rates, and some didn't have any sales tax at all. And I think I remember that it was a court case that finally said, no, you can't be engaging in that kind of regulatory arbitrage. I can't remember the term, the basis for the decision. It might have been a commerce clause type basis for that decision. But it was a court. It was the court that stepped in that case. And as I recall, they had a year to comply with that. So they were even given a sort of grace period to try to figure out how to come into compliance with that.
Okay, any other questions?
I think Dr. Thelen did a great job of answering any potential questions that were there throughout her entire talk. So thank you, Dr. Thelen, for everything.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks for our audience for joining us as well.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I'm sure everybody's Zoom has such Zoom fatigue by this time in the pandemic, but thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I can, I think we can all agree on that, but thank you for kicking off our series, Dr. Thelen. And then for those who are interested in joining our next session, which will be in 1 week's time on the 14th, please join us at the same time. The link to where this talk and presentation will be posted, and then our entire series is going to be posted in the chat box one more time by myself. So on that note,
Right. Next week, Dr. Moira Bailey will be joining us from Northwestern University, and her title is "Can we have an ethical internet? Can we have an ethical internet?" So join us to find out the answer to that question. Thanks again, Dr. Thelen.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
thanks all.
Thank you.